Hello, I'm Scott Walter, the president of Capital Research Center in Washington, D.C. I'm very pleased today to be here with my old friend, Dinesh D'Souza. Dinesh, of course, is famous for his many books. The very first one was on the New York Times bestseller list for weeks and weeks, and almost all the rest have been as well. He also is known for making a number of documentaries, including some of the highest grossing documentaries that have ever been made. Certainly the highest grossing documentaries ever made by someone on the conservative side. Dinesh, it's great to be with you. Our friendship actually goes back to, I think, 1985, around the time that I was getting out of college and joining AEI full-time, and you were getting off the Domestic Policy Council. And then amusingly, many years later, I ended up on the Domestic Policy Council. But
God, my gosh, yes, we go back to a little after my college days, really, and the very start of my career. So it's really been fun to see how things have gone through the years. Of course, the world is very different now. And but I'm glad to see you're doing well, and I'm excited to do this interview with you.
Well, my idea for the interview is that you are reasonably skilled as a debater. In fact, our mutual friend Christopher Hitchens once confessed to me that he thought you were the best of the many people who ever debated him on the atheism questions. So I thought it would be a fun interview to have Dinesh D'Souza meets his critics. So I will be devil's advocate and be throwing at you some of the nastiest criticisms that I could find of your last several movies and books. I have to admit that it's not hard to find very bitter criticisms of you. And since, as myself, I have been in editing and writing in public policy world for all those decades now. And I definitely have noticed a tendency among writers and pundits to be highly jealous of other people's success. So I'm sure part of the bitterness comes from the fact that given that your critics are so much smarter than you, it really is outrageous that your books sell better and you make movies that set box office records. That's a very bitter thing for your superiors to bear. So try to be patient with them.
Well, Scott, as you know, I started out in very much the same world that many of these critics inhabit. And I spoke in their language and I was part of their circle. And but I made a decision, partly driven by just a reflection upon my own career, but also partly by circumstances. My infamous case with the Obama administration involving campaign finance violations. I came to a different understanding of what the other side is about and the way that it operates and the way that it fights. And as a result, I modified my approach. So it's not really a departure from kind of the old Dinesh, but rather it is a modification of tone. It's also a modification of format. In other words, I make movies as well as write books. I still do the old thing, but I also do some new things. And part of, I think, what's going on is that critics don't realize that a new format requires a new approach. I actually sound different on Twitter than I sound in a debate. A movie is not the same thing as a book. A book, fundamentally, a good book is an argument. So a book exists, you may say, in the mind of the reader. But a movie is a narrative. It's an emotional story. Now, you can pack a lot of information in a movie, but if you think of a movie as sort of messaging, or if you think of a movie as sort of 5 reasons for this or that, you miss what movies are, and you actually miss why people go to the movies, which is primarily for entertainment. People go to movies to feel a certain way, and they read books to think a certain way. And so I've tried to adapt my work to these different outlets. And part of the confusion and even some of the vitriol is based, I think, on a misapprehension of this simple fact.
Well, I certainly think there need to be more conservatives telling stories through movies and songs and other things, because we do a very good job of statistics and dry argument, but we hardly even attempt the telling of stories in compelling ways. So I agree.
Yes, the left is actually, they're the masters of narrative. And what they do is they build what, to my mind, are sort of bogus narratives, but they do develop a narrative. You have to give them that. And so, to take the small example of George Floyd, they take the case, the incident involving George Floyd, and they don't make what to us would seem the obvious inference. The obvious inference is, hey, if you think that George Floyd was mistreated by this cop, you would want an approach that says, how do we get fewer bad cops and more good cops? There's no obvious jump to a separate conclusion: defund the cops, right? Because defund the cops depends on a hidden premise, which is that there's something about cops, including black cops, that makes them racist. And then on top of that, you have further ambitious claims that these cops are racist, not because there's racist cop training per se, but because they're part of a racist society, a racist education system, a racist culture. And that this chronic racism goes back not just to 1776, but 1619, to invoke the New York Times' 1619 Project. So this is a narrative. It's a storyline. Now, it cannot be countered by isolated facts. Because ultimately it is a narrative is not a fact, it is an interpretation of a fact. It is the situation of various facts into a coherent storyline. And very often we, our side, conservatives, Republicans, do not present counter narratives. In other words, if American history isn't that way, well, what way is it? And this is now the driving force of my work, is to try to combat false narratives with true narratives. True narratives require you to tell a story as well as to situate facts within it.
Great. Well, let us start then on some of your films and books, but they tend to get reviewed and criticized in the same way, whichever version it may be, the book or the movie. So the first one I'm going to do is the Death of a Nation, and here's Publishers Weekly's complaint. D'Souza's central comparison of the welfare state to slavery is more hyperbole than analysis, and is over-the-top vilification of everything democratic. He paints Franklin Roosevelt as a fascist who castigated wealthy Republicans and conservatives in the same type of language that Hitler used against the Jews, makes much of the reading experience akin to viewing the United States in a funhouse mirror. True or false?
One problem, and this I think is going to be a chronic problem with criticism, is that you'll find that in every case, the critic doesn't actually state my argument and then proceed to say what's wrong with it. Rather, they begin with a description of my position that is unrecognizable to me. And so I'm forced at every stage, in my own work, I try really hard. If I'm describing, for example, I have a recent book on socialism. If I'm talking about the socialists, I'll begin by saying the socialists think this. And then I will say, and in thinking about socialists, these are the people that we can call socialists. These are the people that we can call maybe socialist light. And these are the people who are moving us in the direction of socialism, even if they're not themselves socialists. So in other words, I try to take trouble to represent other people's views in a way that they go, yeah, that's what I do think. And I think both in debate and argument, it's obligatory for critics to do this. And otherwise, you're taking a very cheap road, which is that you're smuggling your own criticism into your description of what somebody else is saying. So let's look, for example, at some of the claims, a handful of the claims in Death of a Nation that relate to this. First of all, nowhere do I say that socialism and slavery are identical. Not at all. Death of a Nation really is focused on the issue of fascism. And in the course of discussing fascism, we also discuss Nazism. Now, Nazism and fascism are not identical. Fascism by itself is not a race-based ideology. Nazism is. In fact, Nazism is kind of fascism plus the Nazi doctrine of racial supremacy. That's sort of the distinctive aspect that Hitler brought to fascism. Now, it turns out, I began my research on this by starting off, you may almost say, where Jonah Goldberg left off. Jonah Goldberg explored some fascinating ties between fascism and progressivism. Essentially, what Jonah argued, picking up, by the way, from Hayek, is that you had three sort of sister ideologies, progressivism, fascism, and communism, that all developed around the same time in opposition to what can be called sort of classical liberalism or liberal capitalism. And all these three ideologies, although distinct in important ways, nobody would say progressivism equals communism or even communism equals fascism, but they were cousins. They were all statist. They all involved moving society away from free markets and toward the centralized state. And this was a powerful trajectory in the 20th century. And all the people who were in these movements came out of the same side of the aisle. So to take, for example, fascism developed semi-independently in about 7 countries. It developed in Belgium, it developed in France, in Germany, in Italy, in England. So there were founders of fascism in all those countries. Now, if you look at them, without exception, every single one of the founders of fascism in all the countries are men of the far left. In England, Mosley was literally thrown out of the Labour Party because he was too left-wing, and then he became a fascist. And we find in France, the leading fascists were, some of them went back to the turn of the century, the 19th century. They were part of the socialist movement in the late 19th century. In Italy, Mussolini and his buddies came out of the Marxist movement. They were a faction of the Marxist movement, but they were part of that movement. And later, when Mussolini established an independent fascist entity, his chief advisor was the co-founder of the Italian Communist Party. So the links between progressivism, communism, fascism are there. Now, Jonah Goldberg stopped short of going to Nazism. I think he felt that the Holocaust, Nazism is in a special category. And of course, the Holocaust is in a special category. But I was talking about early Nazism. Interestingly, early Nazism was very appealing to many people in America. It had a lot of American recruits. Not only did progressivism influence Nazism, but Nazism influenced progressivism. And this fact is both in my books and movies. I'll just take 2 notable examples. The Nazi sterilization laws were essentially lifted verbatim from progressive sterilization laws promoted by Margaret Sanger and her friends. Now, this is not even something that was done secretly. The progressives in America knew about this. They were super excited that the Nazis had done this. Sanger gave speeches talking about how happy she was that the Nazis were, from her point of view, ahead of America in implementing these birth control schemes. So there is direct influence. It's not resemblance, it's actual borrowing. Second, historians have actually only recently kind of developed this idea, but there's tremendous documentation for it. The Nazis who wrote the Nuremberg laws, which made Jews into second-class citizens, had meetings in which they were holding in their hands the democratic laws of the Jim Crow South. So it's important to realize that every segregation law in the South was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor. There are no exceptions to this rule. The Nazis knew all this, and they had these laws in their hands. And in trying to think about formulating what they called the world's first racist state, one of the Nazis literally said, "We don't have to form the world's first racist state because the Democratic Party in America has already done this for us. We just need to take their model and use it." And so they looked, for example, to the one-drop rule that the Democrats were using in the South, basically saying that if you had any traceable black ancestry, that made you black. And the Nazis actually decided to take a softer line on this than the Democrats. They adopted what can be called the 3/4 rule, which is that you need 75% of Jewish ancestry in order to be a Jew. But if you were 1/10 Jewish or 1/25 Jewish, no, you wouldn't count because you didn't have enough. So they, as one Nazi put it, the one-drop rule, he said, is a little too harsh. The Nazis felt that they couldn't go as far as the Democrats. So now these facts are anchored in the record, and they have been written about by mainstream scholars, and I cite them. Now you'll notice that none of these reviews actually consider any of this. They don't consider the fact that FDR, although not a fan of Hitler, as I make very clear, was in fact a big fan of Mussolini. FDR spoke very favorably about Mussolini. He sent members of his brain trust to fascist Rome to study Mussolini's policies, which he saw as more progressive than the New Deal. FDR wasn't alone, by the way. The New Republic, many other intellectual organs of the progressive left were very enthusiastic about Mussolini, and it was a mutual admiration society. Mussolini reviewed FDR's book in an Italian magazine, and he basically goes, "This guy's a fascist, just like us." So these ties are in the record. Now, by the way, the left has worked really hard. Much of what we call history is progressive history. They've written the textbooks. They control the History Channel. They control Wikipedia. So the stuff I'm saying can't be found in those places for the simple reason that the progressives have made sure that it's been left out. It's not in the textbooks. But yet I'm citing mainstream sources. I'm providing all the documentation. There's not a single historian of any competence who has challenged me in any of these facts. But what they do is they'll rely on a caricature of what I said, as if FDR's attack on bankers and its resemblance to Hitler's attack on Jewish capitalists. There is a sort of surface resemblance there, but that's not the heart of my case. The heart of my case is that FDR had actual ties with the actual fascists, and the actual fascists, not only in Italy, but in Germany, were fans of FDR. FDR was championed by the early Nazi newspapers, and I have all the quotations in the book. All of this stuff is what the left would have to deal with in a genuine refutation. And that's my problem, is that there are no genuine refutations. What you get are mischaracterizations that then force me to defend views that I don't really hold and have never really publicly argued.
Well, since the Capital Research Center spends so much time studying bad funding by the left, I should just add the footnote that progressive foundations like Carnegie, Rockefeller were funding lots of eugenics and even just raw racist research. And in fact, Carnegie was funding in Germany all the way through to 1939. And has never apologized for its role in that.
Now, what you're pointing to is a very important phenomenon, which is that social Darwinism and eugenics were part of progressivism. The progressives championed these causes. Now, this crucial fact was carefully hidden by the historian Richard Hofstadter in his book on social Darwinism, published much later. Hofstadter pretended like social Darwinism meant nothing more than applying the principles of free market economics to the marketplace under the theory that the fittest companies would survive. And he acted like that was the heart of social Darwinism. But actually, that was not the heart of social Darwinism. There might have been one or two scholars, perhaps Herbert Spencer, who argued in that mode. But most capitalists never read Darwin. They never bothered to make Darwinian arguments for their beliefs. Their belief was that markets work, markets produce prosperity. They were anchored far more in Adam Smith than they were in Darwin. The real thrust of social Darwinism was on the social side, which is, in Margaret Sanger's words, to get rid of human weeds, to prevent horrible people and useless people from being born. This was the heart of the progressive cause, and Hofstadter's job, which I think he performed very self-consciously, there's no other way to look at it, was ultimately to take all of that and put it under the rug and reinvent social Darwinism at a time when it was losing popularity in such a way that it could be pinned on the right. And the same thing has happened to fascism more generally, and Nazism. If you go to the Nazi 20-point platform, you know, there it is, and you find it on Google and read it. It doesn't sound like something that's coming from the right at all. Donald Trump would not be on board with any of the planks. Now, true, there's anti-Jewish stuff that you won't hear explicitly on the left today, but if you remove that and look for the actual substantive social policy content of the Nazi 25-point platform, essentially cross out the word Jews and read it without that, it sounds like something drafted by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. It's a leftist agenda. That's what I was trying to say, that the Nazis were on the left, they saw themselves on the left, their critics saw them on the left, and the notion that Nazism is a right-wing phenomenon is a progressive invention post-World War II.
Now, to stick to that same Publishers Weekly review of Death of a Nation for a moment, they do actually have some praise for you, and it's about a different set of connections that you make in the book. They say that you're cogent on several things, including the connection between today's white nationalists like Richard Spencer and left-wing identity politics. I confess that was my favorite part of the book and the movie. Can you explain a little bit about those connections?
Remember that Richard Spencer is the poster boy of white supremacy. He has been featured that way in the media. He was trotted out as the poster boy of Charlottesville, the supposed alt-right rally in Charlottesville. He is the basis, in fact, the most concrete face of the idea that white supremacists support Trump. Normally, you'll notice that when the left says this, they provide no evidence. They have never done any kind of survey of skinheads or members of the Ku Klux Klan. They don't have any voting data, none of it. Their idea of making their case is essentially to show a picture of some guy, some Klansman wearing a Trump hat, and then they trot out Richard Spencer, who seemed to be a Trumpster in 2016. But if you begin to read Richard Spencer's views, you begin to realize right away that he's no right-winger. He's actually a left-winger. He's a left-winger, you may say, of the old sort, of the old democratic sort. And he's a statist. He wants a powerful centralized government. He wants nationalized healthcare. He believes in sort of state control of society for the benefit of whites. So you may say he's a statist, and he practices identity politics, and if he had a hashtag, it would be White Lives Matter. Now, the Democrats don't believe that white lives matter. They emphasize today that Black lives matter, but notice that in both cases, there is a racialization of politics. This is not just a defense of life, a defense of human dignity. It's an attempt to capitalize on race for political gain. And the important thing historically is that the Democrats invented this game. It came really out of the Civil War. When slavery ended, the Democrats used white nationalism as the glue in order to establish what came to be called the Solid South. It became a Solid South. Remember, the South wasn't solid before the Civil War. In fact, the very doctrine of states' rights that the South invoked ensured a tremendous heterogeneity in the South, because states' rights means everyone goes their own way. So a guy from Arkansas didn't identify with a guy from Missouri. A guy from Florida didn't identify with a guy from Texas. Not at all. After the war, the Democrats realized we don't have slavery, but we do have racism. Why don't we cultivate that? Why don't we build on that? So I saw that Richard Spencer is in this tradition. The Democrats have made some pivots, but they have made pivots within the racialized paradigm. They've essentially gone from white lives matter to Black lives matter. But in every other respect, Richard Spencer is on the left. His heroes are progressives. He doesn't like Reagan. He doesn't like the founding. He doesn't believe that there are inherent human rights. And so when I exposed this in the movie, there were a lot of people, even on the conservative side, who were a little baffled because they sort of accept the idea that there are left-wing extremists and there are right-wing extremists, and they kind of had felt like, well, we're sort of saddled with Richard Spencer. He's kind of on the extreme of our side, not realizing that he's really not. Just as Mussolini is not, and Hitler is not. I was vindicated really quite startlingly just a few weeks ago when Richard Spencer basically came out and said, not only am I endorsing Biden, but I'm voting the straight Democratic ticket. So here's a guy who was briefly for Trump, I think on the immigration issue alone. And even there are important differences with Trump. I mean, Trump is in favor of legal immigrants, doesn't want illegals. Richard Spencer doesn't want either. In fact, he told me in the interview I did with him in the movie, he'd be like, well, Dinesh, I'm going to figure out a way to send you home. So Spencer, I was very happy to have sort of outed a couple of years ago. And now Spencer himself has come out very clearly as being a Biden guy and essentially a committed Democrat.
Maybe he was worried he'd get fewer media interviews if he didn't.
Well, I think there is an opportunistic element to all these guys. In fact, the guy, Jason Kessler, one of the organizers of the Charlottesville rally, was an Occupy Wall Street guy. He came out of the left. And again, this echoes what I was talking about earlier, which is the origin of the fascist movements in leftist politics. When you trace the roots, you begin to see a kind of development there. And so, look, white identitarian politics is not what the Democrats are into now, but it is a close cousin of black identitarian politics. These are cousins across the aisle. They both favor segregation, although different types of segregation. They both favor racial supremacy, also different types of racial supremacy. They both use race for political gain. Race is the key to how they see themselves and to the policies that they want for society. And all of this is in dramatic contrast with conservatives and libertarians and classical liberals, all of whom see race as the painted face. And something that we actually want to get away from and get beyond.
Well, you've done a wonderful job on a lot of the substance, the criticisms launched against you. You also, of course, get criticized for your methods. So let me turn to a question or two on that. The Guardian, again, talking about Death of a Nation, says D'Souza is not really trying to convince anyone who doesn't already agree with him. True?
Not true. But there is a grain of truth in what they're saying, and let me explain. I think it would be fair to say that in my early career at Policy Review, then on at AEI, and my early career at Hoover, I saw myself as part of a community of intellectuals that spoke within the intellectual camp. So if someone were to ask me, who am I actually talking to? I would say, well, I see myself as part of a conservative movement, and we're developing ideas collectively through criticism and exchange that articulate the conservative idea. And if I'm trying to convince someone, it's going to be fence sitters and middle of the roaders and sort of head scratchers who aren't sure, but are also part of that intellectual movement, but occupy some position on the middle. I think it would be naive of me or anyone on the right to say we're trying to convince the sort of far left. I was never trying to convince David Corn or some Antifa type, at least ancestral Antifa type. I saw the futility of that, but I was trying to convince people. At that time, there was a guy, Jim Sleeper, who wrote, I think, for the New York Daily News. I had very good relations with Hitchens. I knew E.J. Dionne from the Washington Post. And so I would say, in some senses, if someone were to ask me, who are you addressing your ideas and your articles to? I would say, well, I'm in the small magazine world writing for those guys. Now, two experiences sort of changed my thinking about that. The first is when I had my case, my campaign finance case, I called upon some of these guys, my friends, I thought, to defend me. And to a man, they would say to me privately, "Oh, Dinesh, you're really getting shafted. This is terrible. What you did was a very minor infraction." And I said, "Well, you know, it would be really helpful if you were to say that, because you've got a powerful perch at the Washington Post and the New York Times." But none of them, and I emphasize the word none, would come to my defense. I then realized that these were not gentlemen of the sort I had thought. They are unreliable even when it comes to an issue of something that they themselves believed. It wasn't that I was trying to convince them. They agreed that this was bad, but they absolutely refused to say so. That was number one. The second thing I notice is that many of these guys are professional head scratchers. And by that, I mean, I would see them in 1986, and then I would turn on C-SPAN, and there they were in 1996, and they were saying the same thing, and they were still scratching their heads. And I realized that if I talk to them for another 10 years, they'll be scratching their heads in 2006 and again in 2016. And I thought to myself, really, is this really a project worthy of my life's work? To try to convince these professional head scratchers who essentially have not evolved one iota over decades, who write the same articles 30 years later that I saw them write, you know, when I was beginning my career. I thought to myself, this is a little bit of a futile enterprise. And then I noticed at the same time that there was a large body of people across the country, many of them not schooled in the Ivy League, some of them who had just gone to high school, others who had gone to 2 years of college or maybe 4 years of college, but then spent most of their time raising their kids or working in a bank. And these are people who had a genuine interest in the American founding. They wanted to know what made America exceptional. They wanted to know who are the people who attack America. In other words, these are people who wanted to learn. And there was no mechanism for them to actually learn. And yet they were hungry for knowledge. And I thought to myself, wow, this is actually a much better constituency for me. Why? Because I think part of my strength is to be able to take ideas, including complex ideas, and present them in an understandable way, and later through films in a pictorial way. And so this is a kind of public educational mission. And when I first came to Washington, I wanted to be a public intellectual, but I think I didn't really know what that meant. To me, what it means now is someone who actually educates the public. And doesn't join a kind of charmed circle of people, a kind of mutual admiration society in which you spend all your time courting the respect of people who ultimately aren't going to convince you, aren't going to be convinced by you, and aren't going to help you when the chips are down. I think one of the reasons that we have this sort of treason de clerc, the treason of the intellectuals, even on the conservative side, is many conservative intellectuals are beholden to the progressive left. They depend for their credibility and bona fides on what progressives say about them. So how can you expect them to contest progressive orthodoxy at its core when ultimately they are, in a sense, a minority of courtier intellectuals wooing the very progressive class whose ideas they need to be debunking? So this is the sense in which I'm actually glad to be out of that game, at least to a degree. I'm still doing what I did before. I speak in a more colloquial language because I'm trying to reach a different sort of person. But I think that in some ways I'm mentally more liberated and I'm able to challenge orthodoxies in a more bold way because ultimately I'm not swimming within parameters that have been set for me by other people.
The greatest downfall of many conservative intellectuals is refusing to challenge the premises of the other side. They simply accept them and then try to make the arguments with 1.5 hands tied behind their back.
Well, I think the other thing is that a lot of my work is difficult because the spade work that would make it easy is not done by other conservatives. So for example, let's take LBJ, Lyndon Johnson. Now, Lyndon Johnson, it is very clear, routinely used the N-word after he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. in a memoir, Lyndon Johnson's driver, said that Lyndon, he asked Johnson to call him by his name. And Johnson said, absolutely not. I'm going to call you chief, or I'm going to use the N-word. And he basically said, get used to it. And this was Johnson. There are multiple sources, historians, Robert Caro in his book, Master of the Senate, Doris Kearns Goodwin, and others who have all documented, notice that these are progressives documenting, that LBJ used the N-word. Now, if that is so, then the whole leftist narrative that LBJ underwent a moral evolution from his early racist days in rural Texas to becoming an enlightened champion of civil rights, a narrative extremely important to the left because it mirrors their story about the whole Democratic Party, that it evolved LBJ style toward enlightenment. Now, debunking this narrative is of extreme importance. And you would think that there would be a half dozen critical conservative biographies of LBJ that would really dig into this to show that LBJ had racist reasons for signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and what those reasons were. But in fact, there is no such biography. No conservative in the entire country has taken on himself or herself the labor of saying, you know what, for my PhD thesis or my first book, I'm going to dive into LBJ. I'm going to look at all the stuff that Caro didn't look at. I'm going to look at all the stuff that's not in the progressive biographies, because the progressives do not hesitate to leave massive things out, especially things that are inconvenient to their side. This is also true, by the way, of Dalek's biographies of FDR, for example. He leaves out all the stuff about Mussolini. He leaves out all the stuff about the Nazis. He leaves out all the stuff about all the praise for fascism coming from the left. He doesn't want any of that in his massive biography. So this is how the left is. And I count on the right to do the digging on the other side. But so few people on our side are doing that kind of digging. And it's almost like a lot of our intelligentsia is out to lunch. I mean, they're spending their time scratching their head about Trump on the one hand, on the other hand, when there's valuable intellectual work to be done that is being left undone.
Well, one more question on the, you might say, the business model of the Dinesh D'Souza empire. This is Variety now, the Hollywood newspaper. They're nice enough to say that you're not the only one who's this deplorable. Lots of conservatives apparently are. So their claim is, the more that mainstream journalists go into high dudgeon over Dinesh's lies and mudslinging, the more he can feed the bonfire of the culture war. It's the formula that was put in place 30 years ago by right-wing talk radio, and that Fox News honed to a crude edge of firebrand theatrics. If your agenda is to stoke resentment and create cartoon enemies, then you don't need to be accurate.
Well, I've tried to think of how to respond to all this. Scott, I think you can verify that I have been very lucky and successful in my career from a very young age. My very first book, Illiberal Education, was 15 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, and made my reputation. I've had multiple New York Times bestsellers long before the talk radio circuit, long before I made a single movie. I started speaking in 1991, I believe, right after Illiberal Education came out. And speaking was very lucrative. I could make thousands of dollars a day by giving the same speech again and again on different campuses. And I did that for years. So the truth of it is, between my perch at a think tank, between my books, between my speeches, I literally could have stopped working in my 30s. I wasn't looking for a business model. I don't need a business model. I never have. And those aspects of my career, which started at a very young age, have continued to this day. It's not as if they dried up and I needed to become another Rush Limbaugh. Not at all. I'm still writing books, and my books are more successful than ever. I'm still speaking on the campus and elsewhere. It was almost by accident that I made the first movie, the Obama movie. And I did it without even thinking of it as a commercial enterprise. I literally thought it would be amusing to try to test my hand at making a documentary. I went to people to ask them for money, and they kind of laughed at me. They go, well, you've never done this before. And I had to say to them, well, think of it as a donation. And then if I can give you your money back, let's do it again. In other words, the phrase I literally coined was recycled philanthropy. I went into movie making on that basis. Now, again, my first film on Obama was very successful. I've been able to get people in the theater to watch films. And by the way, the people, I'll stand in the back of the theater, it's dark, and I'll see some, Hispanic guy with his wife and 5 kids. And, I see them walk out of the theater, and they stand up and applaud at the end of the movie, and there's like a tear running down the guy's face. And I say to myself, wow, I mean, that's never a guy I would see standing in line in Barnes & Noble to get a signed copy of my book. So that's what motivates me, is the ability to reach people, who, like me, have often started life at the bottom, who view the American dream as a ladder, who see themselves as struggling up the ladder. My politics is ultimately, it's based on that primordial immigrant experience of coming to America in search of a better life. And so I think that's why my point of view resonates. I don't tell anyone lies. In fact, I think what makes my work controversial is that it makes claims that are true that the other side has trouble refuting. No one has made so many extreme statements about the left that all happen to be true. Now, in some cases, when I've made a mistake, and I have, I will admit it right away. So to give you an example, I made the statement a few years ago that no Republican owned a slave. That of the 4 million slaves that existed in the United States in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War, virtually all of them were owned by Democrats. Now, Kevin Cruz, an historian at Princeton, assembled a team of 150 historians to attack this single claim because he knew how devastating it is. It means that America didn't do slavery, the Democrats did. Slavery wasn't something distributed across the society. Slavery was concentrated in the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party was the party of the plantation. So he knew how crushing this was. And so the historians dug deep, and they basically found, I would say, about a dozen Republicans who owned slaves. Now, this is itself an anomaly. Why would a Republican own a slave? First of all, Republicanism was strong in all the free states where slavery wasn't even allowed. But there were a handful of border states. Now, it turns out that there were some Democrats in those border states, slave owners, who were for slavery, but they were not for secession. They were scared of secession. They knew that secession would mean war, and they thought that that might mean the end of slavery. So they became Republicans at the last minute in order to avert secession and war. Essentially, they thought that the Republican compromise, which is to stop the spread of slavery, would protect their slaves in the South and in the border states. So there were a handful, and I think the number is somewhere between 10 and 20 Republicans out of 4 million who own slaves. So see how my general point is undisturbed. But the moment I saw that there were some Republicans who owned slaves in Delaware and in Missouri, I was like, you know what? I made a mistake. I should not. I made a generalization because I didn't know of a single case of a Republican who owned a slave, because it's difficult to be able to sort of disprove a negative. But just by showing me these handful of examples, I have to correct myself. And so I did it publicly and immediately. And I said, but let's remember that my general point, that the Democratic Party is the party of slavery, that the vast, vast majority of slaves were owned by Democrats, all of that remains true. And so in the rare cases, and they've been extremely rare, where I've actually made a mistake, I have been, I think it's fair to say, quite willing to publicly acknowledge it.
Well, speaking of party politics, back in the Reagan administration, you served on Reagan's Domestic Policy Council at the White House, as we mentioned. Is there anything that you learned about how the White House operates that would shine a light on the current presidency?
I think that I learned a lot in the Reagan White House. I had never been in government before, and it was a fantastic opportunity at a young age to see government pretty much up close. I didn't have any direct dealings with Reagan, but I did get to stand in the back of the room while the senior staff would participate in meetings, and I could take notes. So I could observe. And I learned fascinating things about Reagan, fascinating things about government in general, interesting things about the White House. I mean, the White House is a sort of a quarterback, you might say. And you have all these cabinet agencies, which are sort of rival fiefdoms. And if a typical problem arises, let's say drugs, it's interesting to see how the Defense Department will classify this. Well, it's a problem of, the drugs growing in Colombia. It's a defense problem. And then the Health and Human Services Department will say, no, it's a kind of a health problem. It needs a medical solution, and that's going to be kind of our purview. And then the Education Department says, actually, no, the problem of drugs is that there's a demand for drugs. And so people need to be educated about drugs, and that's kind of our domain. And so you've got all these, and this is all on the same side, on the Republican side, competing fiefdoms, all pulling public policy issues in their own direction. And so it's just fascinating for me to see this organism called government, and how it does a few things well, but it does most things very badly, very inefficiently. And this is just as true, by the way, of the Defense Department as it is of the Post Office. I mean, think about the Post Office. We've had airplanes for over 100 years, and yet the post office, if it had not been for UPS or FedEx, the post office to this day would not have figured out that it could deliver overnight mail. That's because they don't think that way. There's no profit motive. There's no reason to think in terms of making things more efficient or better. In fact, to the degree you do, and you use technological solutions, you're only eliminating the jobs of the people who are there. So the mentality of government is totally different. One of my best career decisions, I think, was, even though I learned a lot from the Reagan White House, and I could have gone into the White House under George H.W. Bush, I think I got very good career advice from the head of AEI, then a man named Chris DeMuth, to come to AEI, develop a field of knowledge, write books that would establish my own reputation. In other words, establish a presence in the private sector, even though initially in the nonprofit sector. And that would stand me in better stead in the long run. So it was one of the better decisions I made, not to stay in government and become a sort of professional or habitual bureaucrat.
Interesting. Well, let's go all the way back to that same mid-'80s era. After you left the White House, you came to AEI with Chris DeMuth, great man, and you also became the editor-in-chief of Crisis magazine, which is still published. And one of your early things you did involved that mutual friend again of ours, Christopher Hitchens. You did an interview with him and you outed him in a way that may surprise some people. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
This was an interview I published in Crisis with Hitchens about the issue of abortion, or the so-called pro-life issue. And it was an article in which Hitchens sort of came out on the pro-life side. This had emerged in a somewhat casual conversation I had with Hitchens, where he had confessed to having moral anxieties about abortion. And I had asked him at the time to reconcile those with his atheist position, because in general, one would expect that an atheist wouldn't care that much about the abortion issue, or would be by and large on the pro-choice side. And Hitchens responded in a very interesting way. He said that precisely because he was an atheist, and because this life was, as far as he was concerned, the only life, he thought it made it a special crime, a special horror, that life would be terminated at the outset. In other words, if you think of this life as 1 second in a large expanse of eternity, And then if you take an unborn child and let's say terminate its life, but it goes, let's say from a Christian point of view, straight to heaven, then arguably the child has a destiny, an eternal destiny that redeems the horror of abortion in the present. But for Hitchens, he said, there is no such redemption. There's only this life. This is the one chance that you get. And I thought, wow, I've never quite heard anyone argue from this position. And so I convinced him to do a sort of a dialogue about it. And in the dialogue, I expected him to, you may say, wimp out on the issue of laws against abortion. In other words, to express a moral concern for the unborn, but then to say, well, nevertheless, I don't want to impose my views on others, or I don't support legislation that would actually make people abide by all this. But he didn't. He actually said, no, I agree that at the end of the day, we need to have laws that would regulate abortion. He didn't come out for an outright ban, but he came out for regulation. And he also came out for regulation at the federal level. In other words, the idea is that if this is a life, it makes no sense, just as it made no sense under popular sovereignty for the Democrats in the 1850s to talk about let each community decide for itself if it wants slavery. The reason that made no sense, as Lincoln pointed out, is because you cannot exercise choice to deny choice. You cannot invoke the right of choice to suppress the choices of others. And so similarly here, what Hitchens was saying is that you can't make it a decentralized decision. You need to have a federal law that starts with the premise that life deserves protection. Constitutional protection and federal protection. And so all of this was in the Crisis article, and it landed as a bit of a bombshell for the left because they weren't expecting this. They're used to a high degree of ideological conformity on this issue because it is such an important issue for them. I was very proud of publishing that article. I think it speaks well to Hitchens that he was brave enough to do it. And by the way, he never backed away from it. Even though many people pressed him to disavow the article, he never did later. And so Hitchens was a man that even from some distance we would have to admire and for whom I always had genuine affection.
Yes, and I can't help noting that this would be a case where it's worth comparing him to Richard Spencer, who is quite fond of abortion for understandable reasons, given his gruesome racial ideology. Well, one last question on good old Hitchens there. You and he definitely had some disagreeing moments in debates over the general question of atheism and theism. What do you think are one or two of his best arguments against you and one or two of your favorite rejoinders to him?
Hitchens was a very tricky guy to debate because you couldn't debate him in the normal way. I remember watching a debate, I think it was between Hitchens and William Lane Craig, the very capable Christian apologist. And Craig would outline the 5 reasons for this and the 4 reasons for that. And Hitchens would not address those, but would rely on slingshots and jibes and guffaws. And he did it all in the Oxford style, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, may I interject, and so on. And I realized that he was having such a jovial time of it that if I were in the audience, if I were a student watching these two men, and I were to ask the question, not who has the better argument, but which guy would I like to meet after this debate for a drink or for dinner, the choice would go overwhelmingly to Hitchens. And I realized from that debate is ultimately not merely an intellectual exchange, because ultimately when someone is watching a Christian debate an atheist, they're asking themselves, would I rather be a Christian or an atheist? Would I rather be more like Dinesh or would I rather be more like Hitchens? So Hitchens' arguments were in that sort of bohemian mode. This is the type of thing he would say. Well, Dinesh, he'd say, I've just gotten back from North Korea. He goes, I've met God. His name is Kim Jong-il. He's a lot like your God, but to be honest, I would much rather live under Kim Jong-il than I would under your God, because at some point Kim Jong-il will die and the tyranny will come to an end. But Dinesh, in your scheme, it lasts forever. Your God is a far worse tyrant than Kim Jong-il. Now, this is not intended as an argument per se, but it's kind of whimsical, it's witty. It tells the audience that Hitchens is a man about town. He's cosmopolitan. He just got back from North Korea. He's speaking from experience. He's expressing this kind of bold revolt against anyone tyrannizing over him in any way, this kind of radical expression of freedom. And so I always had to think to myself, now, how do you refute that? What do you say in response to that? And so with Hitchens, it was always a matter not merely of meeting the argument, but ultimately speaking a language that was itself, you may say, Hitchensian, that engaged him at his own level and in his own terms. And so, and flustered him on his own terms. And he would definitely be flustered that way. So to give you, I think, one of my best arguments where I literally could see him look very disconcerted. And he'd confess later to me, he goes, I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board on that one, is he was invoking the Freudian argument that religion is wishful thinking. This comes from Freud's book, Religion, the Future of an Illusion. And the idea here is very simple, that Christians cannot bear the actual sufferings of life. They get diabetes, they get old, they get sick. And because they cannot cope with suffering in the world, they manufacture in their mind another world called heaven, which liberates them from having to face the world as it is. So this, you can see, is a very Hitchensian. It's sort of, Hitchens is striking the pose of bravery. He's morally tough in facing the world as it is. We Christians are sort of living in the sort of la-la land. He loved this kind of argument. And my rebuttal to it was, I said, well, Hitchens, there appears to be a grain of truth in what you say. And that if it were true, that Christians wanted to live in a sort of better world than the one we actually inhabit, I can totally see why Christianity and other religions too fabricates the idea of heaven, because heaven is much better than anything that we face in this life. Heaven is no suffering, no hardship, no pain. I go, but you have to admit that Christianity, like Judaism and Islam, also has another concept, which is much harder to square with this Freudian analysis, and that is the idea of hell. Now, hell is a lot worse than diabetes. It's a lot worse than suffering. It's a lot worse than the ordinary pains of life. And in fact, it's eternal. So why would a group of people looking to fabricate this kind of happy place to avoid facing the hardships of life come up with something that is actually far worse than anything that life has to offer? Why would they do that? And Hitchens could not answer. I mean, I think he had never thought of it. It hit him straight between the eyes, and he realized, I've got to come up with a theory that doesn't merely account for heaven, but also accounts for hell. And so we had a lot of this going on back and forth. Sometimes he would say things and I would go, wow, I have to think of a better way to come back on that one. I think one of my best points against Hitchens had to do with life after death. And Hitchens said, in effect, this. He said, you know, Dinesh is an intelligent man, and normally he lives his life by rational calculations. If somebody were to tell Dinesh, you know, your wife is cheating on you, Dinesh would say, well, what's the evidence? So he lives his life by the normal rules of empirical inquiry. He goes, but when it comes to Christianity, Dinesh throws his brains out the window. And so Dinesh will say things like, I believe in life after death. And Hitchens goes, that's ridiculous. Has Dinesh been to the other side of the curtain? Has he seen what comes after death? Does he have 1 ounce of empirical evidence that there's life after death? Of course not. So he's talking complete nonsense. Ultimately, what he's saying is a statement of pure faith that is based upon no evidence whatsoever. In my rebuttal, I said to Hitchens, I said, well, you have explained my belief in life after death as purely the product of faith. So let me ask you, do you believe there's life after death? He goes, no. I said, oh, well, have you been to the other side of the curtain? Have you seen what comes after death? No. In other words, what information do you have that I don't about what comes after? None. So the real difference between you and me is not that you know and I don't know, that you're using evidence and I'm not. The truth of it is we're both making a leap of faith. We both are asserting a belief in something for which neither of us can provide any definitive empirical evidence. I said the real difference between you and me is not that you know and I don't, or that I know and you don't. It is that I will openly and honestly admit that my position is based on faith. Whereas you, poor deluded atheist, somehow think that your position is based on evidence, even though in fact you have none. So this is just to give a feeling of what those debates sounded like. We did about 10 of them. Frankly, I don't think we did a single one in a church. We did one in the Museum of St. Louis. We did one at the University of Colorado in Boulder. We did several on campuses. And so they were debates in front of a secular audience. And that made them particularly engaging and challenging and fun.
Well, I want to thank you again for giving us all this time and for your support for Capital Research's own work. Since you have a lot of fans who will be reading or listening to these words, is there anything that you have coming up that you think your admirers will especially enjoy?
I'd like to mention a couple of things. My current work is focused on socialism. The socialist left. Why? Because I think that a lot of the tactics that we're seeing, the rise, for example, of paramilitary gangs on the street, operating with the apparent toleration, if not encouragement, of the Democratic Party, the emergence of the deep state, by which I mean the police agencies of government, the FBI, the IRS, the CIA, even the DOJ, using their power against political dissidents and political opponents. Now, all of this is tactics. All of this is a means, but a means to what end? Well, I think a means to moving America more in the socialist direction. And I don't just mean economically. Socialism is essentially not only economic control, but control over your life. Control ultimately over what you think and what you say and how you say it and where you say it and how you believe and how you practice your faith. And the left, we have seen very clearly, even in this era of coronavirus, that they do want and like to control all those things. So socialism is, in a way, their end game. They like it because in the end, it empowers people like them. It puts them in the saddle. And it creates two classes of citizens, I think from their point of view, a sort of democratic majority made up of racialized groups. In other words, the new socialism is identity socialism, a kind of marriage of classic socialism and identity politics. It appeals not just to class grievance, but racial grievance, gender grievance, transgender grievance, the line between legals and illegals, and so on. So that's my book, United States of Socialism, and the accompanying movie is called Trump Card, which will be released October 9th in video on demand. And then I'm also, along with my wife, Debbie, the executive producer of a feature film. It's called Infidel. It's a film about radical Islam. It's a thriller and a story. And it reflects my sense that documentaries are good, and they tell an important story. But documentaries are, you may call it the sort of, they're just a part of what Hollywood does. The gold standard of Hollywood is the feature film, by which I mean the family movie, the thriller, the horror film, the romantic comedy. I think at the end of the day, if we're going to create a beachhead in Hollywood, we have to make, we meaning our side, those kinds of films. The good news is that Hollywood films today are, for the most part, horrible. And they are also made for way too much money. I think very good movies can be made, not for a little money, for a lot of money, but for less money than they spend. And so what I'm trying to do in my career, I've become a lot more entrepreneurial, is to now create ways for our side to create educational institutions, media institutions, entertainment institutions that didn't exist before. And it's really fun, and it can have a very positive impact in the long term, because in the long term we can't concede all the large megaphones of our culture to the left. Even if we win an election or two, at the end of the day they will win in the end if we aren't able to compete in getting our message out to enough people.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. So thank you so much, Dinesh.
Scott, it was a pleasure. Good talking to you.